I'd like to welcome our moderator, Christine Ortiz. She's a professor at MIT. Please take it away.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm Christine Ortiz. I am faculty in material science and engineering at MIT. I'm also director of the Technology and Policy Program, which I'd welcome all of you to engage with. So it's a 50-year-old, 2-year policy graduate degree in technology and policy. So please spread the word, or if any of you have interest in it, please let us know. So I'm delighted to introduce 3 amazing panelists today and to have this really important discussion. So first, I'd like to introduce Mona Baranji, the principal economist and director of data analytics at Houghton & Golden. She's an expert in applied econometrics and economic damages quantification, large-scale data science, and machine learning-driven predictive modeling with a focus on labor, antitrust, and complex litigation matters. She holds a PhD in economics from Yale and a master's degree in law and diplomacy from Tufts University. So welcome, Mona. And next, we have Bailey Flanagan, who's an assistant professor of political science and computer science at MIT. She's a leading scholar whose work bridges algorithms, formal theory, and machine learning with political methodology to advance the design and evaluation of democratic processes. She earned her PhD in computer science from Carnegie Mellon University. So welcome. Okay. And our last panelist on the left is Lindsay Batiste, a leading voice and professional at Responsible AI at Google. She works in the areas of AI lifecycle governance, AI ethics, risk analysis and mitigation, transparency, accountability, stakeholder and participatory engagement, and alignment with global regulatory frameworks. She has a master's degree in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School and a bachelor's degree in public affairs, law, and public policy from Indiana University in Bloomington. So welcome, Lindsay. Great. So we have really a wide-ranging expertise on the panel, many different interdisciplinary fields, and we're going to have an amazing discussion today. So we're going to let each of the panelists discuss a little bit about their research in about 5 to 10 minutes each. And then we will move into a few cross-cutting general questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience for a few questions. So maybe we can start with Mona. I think you have some slides.
Yes.
Yeah. So they're going to pull up the slides there, and you're welcome to start.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this panel. Thank you. I'm Mona. I'm a principal economist and director of data analytics at Houghton & Golden. It's a law firm. I just realized I have only 10 minutes, but I had planned for more than that, so I have to rush through. Sorry about that. The agenda for this presentation, I'm going to start talking about poverty, something that is not directly associated with equity, which is the main topic that I'm going to talk about. But then I'll also, given the audience and given that there are lots of graduate students in the audience, I thought maybe I should provide you a quick overview of what we do as data scientists in litigation. Some of you might be wondering that this is a data conference and you're talking about law, litigation, what's the relation? So hopefully there I can clarify what's the value of data science in litigation, and I'll talk about some of the research that we have done and we are working on. So I'm going to start talking about poverty, a topic that economists have studied for years. Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo here at MIT, they won Nobel Prize for working on poverty for many years. And their argument is that poverty is not just lack of money. Poverty is not having the capability to realize one's full potential as human being. There are it's a multidimensional thing. It's lack of health, lack of education, lack of information, lack of access to opportunities. So it's not just money and income. This is the mindset that economists have looked at poverty for many years. So the factors that you're seeing here are different angles of poverty, and it's not just a list, it's circular. So if you don't have good health, it affects your access to education, it affects your living standards, it affects your income and housing, and there we go. So to resolve poverty, it's not enough to provide someone more income. If it doesn't matter how much money you have in your bank account, if you don't have access to clean water, you are still poor. Or if you are living in an area that your kids don't have access to good education, you are still considered poor. So that's why economists have spent many years resolving poverty, but through providing initiatives that touch causes of poverty. That includes education, access to health, and lots of other initiatives. So the reason I started my talk with poverty is because I think equity as a form of democracy within organizations is also lives in systems. It's multidimensional, and this is a topic of a book that I'm writing. So when we are talking about equity and fairness in workplace, it's not just about how much you are earning, what is your compensation, and whether your compensation as a woman is similar to your male counterpart working in the same department and job function. It's also about the opportunities that you are provided in your work. It could be that your compensation is very equal to your male counterpart, but when it comes to assignment of projects, you are assigned different projects. When it comes to promotion decisions, you are treated differently because you're a woman or because you are of a certain race or from certain nationalities. When it comes to performance reviews, you are reviewed differently from other people. So there are lots of aspects to it, when it comes to fairness and equity within organization. It's not just compensation. And this is a pattern that we repeatedly see when we are working with different organizations in litigation context, that they all have good intentions and they don't really mean to discriminate based on gender or race, but at the end of the day, they're so focused on compensation and they think that when compensation is equal, they're treating everyone equal. But beneath that, there are many layers that people are treated differently because of their protected class category. So I'm going to skip this and go very quickly. These are the dimensions that I talk in my book. Now that we think equity is multidimensional, how do we go about measuring that? What are the core components? How do we aggregate and et cetera? So let me skip this. And then I'm going to talk about some of the research that we have done that are related to this concept that shows that different aspects of equity. I had not met Priyanka before and we had not coordinated, but by coincidence, there's a lot of overlap between what I'm covering here and Priyanka's great talk. I'm going to talk about AI in fraud detection algorithms, biased in hiring algorithms, two-sided labor markets, just as examples of different aspects of equity. So this is very close to what Priyanka covered, and it's an article that I have that you should feel free to check. Is use of AI in fraud detection algorithms. It's very widespread. We see it different government institutions, bank, financial institutions, and educational institutions, retail. They are using AI to detect fraud. You wake up in the morning and you realize your bank account is blocked, because you didn't do anything wrong, because maybe yesterday you interacted with the platform in a way that the algorithm thought that you are suspicious and you are not a legitimate user. What is the cost for you? In the best case, the cost for you is few hours of getting in touch with the bank to resolve the issue. But worst case, you could be denied of services if these AI fraud detection algorithms flag you for accessing to some government services. We document many cases in education, in ETS or Duolingo, that because people had certain movement behind the camera, the AI thought some sort of plagiarism is going on, and that applicant was banned from taking the exam forever. Imagine about the opportunity cost that these people suffer. So the false positive could be very small, could be 1%, could be half a percent, but the personal cost to people could be huge. So that's something that I cover in an article. Another example is personalization. We see personalization going a lot in different platforms. And what you see when you go to Amazon is different from what I see because you interact differently with the platform. What I see when I go on LinkedIn is different from what you see. And I provide some examples, and these are the examples that I provide are far from the perfect large-scale randomized controlled trial that we economists like to see. But you can try this example yourself. When you go to LinkedIn and pretend you are a recruiter and you want to hire, you are looking for software engineers. Search for software engineers. You will be presented with 10 options. In the first pass. Now, pretend that you are someone who is biased against hiring women. So you click only on men and start interacting with men. Go check their profile, interact, maybe send a message or connect with them. So interact with them, but completely ignore women. Come back next day and do the exact same search, and you will see women that you used to see in the first stage are either dropped or they are lower in the ranking. So really personalization, even though it sounds great, but it could be problematic if it is providing you options because of your embedded bias. And then some food for thoughts. There are lots of two-sided labor platforms that I'm sure you're aware, and maybe you're using those, like Upwork. There are two-sided labor platforms for hiring nurses. For TaskRabbit, you hire someone for an hour, for 2 hours. There is a lot going on these platforms. Pretty much everything on these platforms are decided by algorithms. How workers are matched to employers, how they are ranked, how they are reviewed, how the rate is decided. And how candidates are filtered, job opportunities are filtered. These are all by AI. Have we unpacked the design logic behind this platform? The algorithms behind these platforms are really complex and opaque. Are we evaluating the equity impact of algorithmic decisions on these platforms? Just some food for thoughts. We have some evidences, not really large scale, but these are things that, as data scientists, we need to consider. So going to the a question that some of you might have in your mind: what is the role of data scientists or economists in litigation? In litigation, a lawsuit has different stages. First stage is investigation, research, and then we go into data and analysis, and it gets more and more sophisticated along the way. First stage is really like research. A lot of what we are doing quantitatively and quantitatively is very similar to academic research with the same rigor, and even the rigor is, I think, is higher because everything that you do has to be produced in the court. So all the codes that we are writing has to be produced in the court and cross-examined by the other side. There are other people that are hired on the other side to exactly criticize your work. So really the margin of error is zero. Even decimal points are not tolerated. So everything has to be very accurate. So I have to rush through, sorry, I had more details to say, but after we identify a case, after we identify that there is some violation of some legal, some policy going on, then we go into impact analysis. We do a lot of regression to show the impact statistically. It's not usually based on one evidence or two evidence. We have to show that something is going on systematically. And then After we establish that there is some statistical evidence for some sort of violation, then the main question is, what is the damage? This is where we, again, start looking at data and quantifying the damage. Like, if assuming there is liability, assuming some organization did something wrong, then what is the cost to those individuals who have been mistreated? In that case, we need to do a lot of simulation and consider counterfactual to show that in absence of that wrongdoing, what would have been the trajectory of that person? If that person was promoted as she was supposed to, what would have been the earning path of that person? And therefore, what is the damage because of that wrongdoing? So, difference between the type of work that we are doing in litigation with academia. In academia, when you are doing a research, it's great to be connected to a policy, but also you are rewarded for doing something novel in your methodology. Novelty sometimes could be penalized in litigation, because in litigation we have to show that the method that we are using has precedent in the past and courts have accepted. And that's why there is a gap between a lot of the models that we are using. They're not very sophisticated, they're very simple. We can't use a state-of-the-art models because there is not enough precedent and you can easily be challenged. I'll skip other details. That was one of the main differences here. And then what makes you very successful as a data scientist or economist in litigation? Of course, economic rigor is very important, but it's an adversarial setting, and you have to respond under pressure. A lot of the times we sit behind the desk with mediator and with jury and with judge, and at the moment you have to be able to defend your model and your technical work. And connected to that, it's very important to be a great communicator. It's not enough to do something really fancy and complicated. It's more important to be able to explain that for a jury who doesn't know anything, not even a simple Excel. And then being honest and truthful is very important. And let me close this part of the talk by saying that there is a lot of data publicly available. When people are denied a promotion, they skip a meeting and they go and leave a review on Glassdoor, on Reddit. Discomfort happens before there is a disparity, before we see something in the data. So there is a lot of public information available, and I encourage everyone in this room, the great data scientists that are in the room, to really pay attention to this data. These data are really valuable. They are lived experiences. They are not just numbers. Discrimination leaves clues. We just need to look in the right places, and these are not numbers. You can look at, there are lots of sentiments on Glassdoor, on Reddit, on LinkedIn, and it's really these days easy to identify where are the red flags. And then very quickly, I'll talk about some of the research that we have done so recently related to AI. So we have processed millions of LinkedIn posts and mapped that with different waves of LLM release, ChatGPT, Claude, and others. It's really interesting to see that right after release of main waves of AI, we see a spike in number of posts on LinkedIn. And these spikes sustain. It's not that people are excited and they post a lot about ChatGPT. It's really, it seems like they're being more capable and confident to express themselves on LinkedIn. And we do a lot of other analysis in the paper to show that it's not just the number, the posts, and as I'm sure you are seeing, the posts are longer, there are more sentences, more complex, more words, more emojis, more bullets, etc. So people are more confident, but what is the consequence for labor market signaling? People who were disadvantaged before now becoming more active, and it's becoming harder to differentiate between skilled workers and non-skilled workers. Another article we have is connected to concept of democracy in data. Court system in the US lives on volumes of PDF files. Each case, just US federal courts, there's 1 billion documents on PACER. A lot of this information are publicly available. Each single case could have hundreds of PDF documents. Each PDF document could be hundreds of pages. These are very complex text information, and that so far it was impossible to process and extract data from. But with the use of LLM, there are many ways you can construct data from these PDF files. And we have used it for different purposes. For example, in each case, the hourly rate of the expert or the attorneys has to be announced in these documents. So far, nobody could process this information. How can you go and search in thousands of PDF pages to find that number? But now with LLMs, you can easily extract that information and see how is the market for attorneys who are working in a particular area, or economic experts, or data scientists who are working on these cases. And we provide other examples of other interesting data sets that you can use based on this. Another research that we have done, I'm sure you all have seen the job posts for AI trainers. They have hourly rates. We processed 25,000 of these job postings just over the past months. There is a wide range of hourly rate. It can range from $20 to you can earn as high as $400 an hour, depending on your background and your education. Now, the policy question here is that if a PhD in mathematics earns $400 an hour and a PhD in linguistics earns $35 an hour, if these two people spend same amount of time and do same level of complexity of work, why there should be this much of disparity? And the problem is more concerning because it seems like STEM areas are paid more, and the STEM areas are associated with men and people of particular origin. So now you see the connection with race, with gender, and why people should be paid differently for doing the same job. Another great research, I'm not going to give away the surprise here. My colleague Alana is there, and she's presenting the poster. In this research, we show how the talent network in tech are connected, where people who are leaving Microsoft, where do they usually land? Do they go to Google or AI, and what happens, and how this network is connected? So I really invite all of you to meet Alana, and she will present this to you. I'll skip this, sharing some thoughts after spending years in the industry. For all the junior young data scientists in this room, find really interesting problems, measure what others ignore, and remember, behind every data set, every single observation, especially in employment and labor, there is one person waiting for a response. It's not just one observation. It's not one data point. It's a lived experience. So each observation is precious, and you really need to understand it. Look for places when workers are underpaid. There is some sort of algorithmic discrimination going on, cases where platforms hide power and courts need evidence. So I hope by this presentation I could provide you an overview of an industry that you would normally not think about as a data scientist. When you talk about data science, everyone, the first thing that comes to mind is tech. Yes, that's a great area to work, but outside of tech and academia, there is a whole big industry in litigation also, and government and policy that is going on that needs your expertise.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And feel free to come back, and then we'll move to the next. So Bailey, feel free, to give some remarks.
No slides, okay. Let me just pull up the.
Oh, sorry. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Bailey. I'm an assistant professor next door. Hello, I got a wave, yay. Okay, so I'm in political science and computer science. The focus of my research is really about broadening democratic participation and deepening it also. And so this means that I work a little bit on standard democratic practices like elections, but I also work on a lot of democratic innovations. I'll give you an example of what that means, but really like at this juncture where democracy is kind of undergoing a weird renaissance of sorts, especially given some of this AI and data and like all these changes that are happening, our public sphere is really changing too. And so while that's scary, this is actually kind of an exciting opportunity to introduce some new democratic methods, I think, that can really help people have more of a say in the societies that are governing them. So that's like a broad overview of what I do, but I think maybe a very relevant question is how do you combine political science and computer science together? Maybe this is where the data science comes in, you can tell me. But from political science, what my research really gets is an understanding of what the democratic problems actually are. So what is happening on the ground in democracy? How are voters behaving? What do they think? What do they want? And also, it gives us a lot of lenses to really critically analyze a lot of the technologies that we're seeing, in particular in the political theory and the humanities. And then also, I think some of that analysis tells us a lot about what we should want out of the algorithms that we're designing and deploying in our societies, whether those are like large language models that are giving voters advice, or maybe, there's one proposal of making artificial intelligence representatives for every person in society and letting them weigh in on political decisions, which maybe that sounds scary, maybe that sounds exciting. I think the question is very complicated, actually. But anyways. So those are the kinds of things that I think about. I'll give you one example of a project that kind of shows how these things come together. And that's also kind of related to some things I will almost certainly bring up later. So one pretty exciting democratic innovation, which certainly has its problems too, though, are citizens' assemblies, which maybe some of you have heard of these. Has anybody heard of them? Seen a lot of blinks. Oh, yay, okay, yeah, nice, okay. They're pretty popular in Europe. In Australia, there are some organizations here that are starting to run them as well. But basically the idea is like, let's say you want to get a large public's opinion on some complicated decision. One thing you could do is a referendum. But referenda have their own issues. Sometimes people, they're not paid to be educated on these issues, and so maybe they show up and they don't really know the details. The referenda can be written strategically, so this isn't always the best way to get really rich, well-considered public input on political decisions. And so citizens' assemblies and similar kinds of democratic technologies offer an alternative to that idea, which is that you randomly select a bunch of people from the public, you bring them together, they deliberate for several days, they learn a lot of information about the issue, and then they make a policy recommendation on behalf of the public. Okay, and so this is a very involved process. I could talk all day about the trade-offs, but one of the most interesting parts of this process to me is how we choose the participants in the first place. This relates to inclusion, it relates to equity and representation. And so one of the biggest parts of my research for the past 6 years has been studying the process by which we randomly select the public to participate. And this is actually a very hard math problem because you want to make sure that the people you choose satisfy a whole bunch of criteria that means that they're sort of at least roughly representative of the underlying population, and you want to be random, and you want to avoid manipulation, and you want to be fair, and all of a sudden you have like a billion objectives and you have to design very complicated algorithms potentially to make that happen. And so when we talk about how do we define the goals of these algorithms, that's really where the political science is coming in. And then the computer science is actually how do we operationalize that. And so we've built a whole bunch of algorithms. You can check them out. They're publicly available for people to use. And you can run them if you want to run your own citizens assembly. But there's a lot of like math and combinatorial optimization and proofs underneath the hood of all of this. But the interface is really about the politics, I would say. Okay, so just to give you a very brief overview of kind of what is the scope of my research, and then I'll wrap up. My research has really like two, I would say, pretty interconnected streams. The first stream is about democratic innovations, like I mentioned, but that's more than just citizens' assemblies. I study the substance of deliberation, like when people sit together and talk about politics, what does that mean? How do they behave? What are their values? How does deliberation shape people's values? I think about participatory budgeting, which maybe some of you know about. Cambridge does it. I think Somerville also does it, but many places do it. It's basically where a bunch of members of the public get together and they decide how to divide a public budget among public interest projects. Also popular in Europe. Let's see if I forgot anything. That's pretty good. Okay, the second stream is, I will broadly call it alignment for decision rules in public contexts. I don't know if you've heard this phrase, AI alignment. It's like all the rage in part of computer science right now. But basically, it's this idea, which is very reasonable, which is that like when we're deploying automated decision rules, for example, like some things that Mona mentioned would be considered automated decision rules. Like you use this example of flagging cheating or like auditing people for like misbehavior or something. And like this can have really significant consequences for their lives. And so the idea is like maybe we should like make sure these technologies act according to our values, which is like a very good idea, but it's actually very difficult to understand what that technically means. And so one thing that I think a lot about is like, what does it actually mean to embed public values into automated decision rules that could be making decisions on our behalf? And while it maybe doesn't sound like these things are related, one place where this comes together a lot is actually in AI for facilitating democratic deliberation and conversation, which could be, for example, social media. That would be like one very like organic example, but another less organic example is where you're actually getting people together in an assembly and they're deliberating and you have an artificial intelligence agent there to help them explore the massive space of policies or help them think about, if this is my goal, how do I get there politically? These are things that people are really proposing. And so across all of these spaces for automated decision rules, whether they're moderating a democratic situation or they're making decisions about auditing, you're implicitly required to specify a model of how people's preferences and values actually look. And this is an extremely loaded decision that gets really swept under the rug when we start thinking about what we want out of equity, because often we're measuring equity at the level of how do we aggregate across different opinions, or is the outcome kind of obeying certain statistical properties, but actually there's something going on much earlier, and it's becoming more and more true as AI gets more and more powerful in how it makes decisions for us. And so anyway, that's another thing that I think about a lot, but thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I'll actually stay seated since we'll go into the panel discussion right after. But thank you all so much. It's really great to be here. I haven't been in Cambridge in about 2 years, I think. So it's great to be back. As you all know, I currently work at Google, but I really just want to preface this conversation with the fact that none of the views I share here are me speaking on behalf of Google. They're me here speaking in my personal capacity, especially because I really care about AI safety and ethics. And so, again, glad to be here. And with that in mind, I'm going to do kind of a lay of the land on the risk landscapes when it comes to the spectrum of artificial narrow intelligence to artificial general intelligence. I know artificial general intelligence is a very loaded term. People define it differently, companies define it differently. And so we're not going to define that here today. So I'll let you leave it to your imagination. But as you know, like the common framing of it is intelligence that is to the level of humans. When we think about artificial narrow intelligence, I want you to think about like very simplistic systems, say like biometric use cases for like face detection and so forth. And I'm starting the conversation with that because I think when we're thinking about the risk associated with AI, like algorithmic bias, that has been an issue that we've seen for some time, right? Like when it comes to companies and their commitments to responsible AI, many of them were around before ChatGPT released in, what was it, like the fall of 22? And so with that, I think it's important to, yes, think about like safety, fairness, privacy, security, accessibility, and how those are, very foundational risks we should consider when thinking about artificial narrow intelligence. But as we're moving on that spectrum and in this point where we are right now, where we have generative AI, which some scientists have framed as like a weak AGI, those risks are amplified, right? And part of that is because how non-deterministic these systems are. Like with artificial narrow intelligence, like they're more deterministic, right? So say if you're using a detection model and you're trying to assess whether something is like a cat or a dog in an image, it's like, yes, this is a cat. No, this isn't a cat. When it comes to non-deterministic systems, like sometimes there's no one right answer. The concept of NORA, right? When you're doing evaluations. And so with that, sometimes there's the use of like Likert scales, like 5-point, 7-point scales to assess the outputs, right? But I'm just trying to, lay the spectrum by which we need to think about the risks, because in Gen AI, they are exacerbated. And I think to that point as well, with the capabilities today of AI models, we now also have reasoning and thinking. And with that comes like these new risks, right, that are hallucinations. And from the OpenAI and Anthropic standpoints, the risk of, say, like persuasion and manipulation. And then I know today we'll also talk about agents a bit. And so we'll probably talk about like traceability and loss of control. But I just want to preface this conversation, right, with like that spectrum of risks, because with that in mind, my work at Google is bringing together the research that we do internally, the evaluations that we do internally, and just like the expertise we have across our responsible AI ecosystem internally to really operationalize responsible AI before we're shipping products and models out to users. And I think to that point, also to preface why I'm here, I have a connection to the Cambridge area. And with that, I actually, when I was here, my focus was more in the artificial narrow intelligence realm. I graduated in 23, so I started my thesis in around 2021. And with that, my focus was on biometric use cases. And of course, the risks that are associated with that, such as fairness concerns, privacy concerns, accessibility as well. I'm sure many of you know of the gender shade study that was conducted by Timnit Gebru and Joy Bulamwini. And I, really anchored on not only, the impact that Timnit Gebru has had in the space, but also I noticed like in that research, there was a focus on obviously race and gender, and to that point, like thought it was even more important to think about other identities that we see oppressed in society, and how technology basically exacerbates that oppression, right? And so also focused on ableism in my research, but to take a step forward to like this conversation now, I think that time around 2021 to 2022, facial recognition, right, was something that was considered high risk, and today is still considered high risk. As many of you have probably kept up in the news with Anthropic and the Department of Defense, DoD, we're talking about surveillance again, right? We're talking about it when it comes to generative AI systems, these non-deterministic systems. And of course, as many of you know, like Anthropic did not feel comfortable with the Department of Defense using their systems because they don't think their systems are up to par to be used in certain military contexts. And I think to that point, again, like anchoring on that spectrum of risk, like even when it's simple, like biometric use cases such as face detection and so forth, like that is high risk. And it is especially exacerbated when we're thinking about like generative AI use cases. So I just want to do that as like a friendly reminder to everyone about the spectrum of risk, and then happy to pass it on.
Great, thank you so much. Really wonderful talks, and we've heard, everything that spans employment, democratic participation, to risk, on the spectrum of risk and AGI. And so we'll try to ask a general question because all of you bring these very different perspectives on the topic. So we'll start with the design, and then we'll move more towards the deployment and the regulation. So my first question for the panelists is, as AI-driven systems increasingly influence who participates, whose perspectives are surfaced, how preferences are expressed, what are the actions that institutions can take around participatory design and participatory guardrails in these digital systems to both have stakeholder engagement, stakeholder collaboration, stakeholder co-creation that is meaningful, and so that these perspectives, broad perspectives, can be embedded in the structures, constraints, evaluation criteria, and feedback signals related to these systems. So really focusing on from your perspective and areas of expertise, share with our community around participatory design and guardrails. So whoever wants to start, feel free to jump in.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay, well, I think the answer to this question probably depends a lot on the context that you're trying to handle. So I guess maybe I'll start with a very specific example and talk about that. Okay, so this issue of like who participates, whose perspectives are surfaced, and how they're expressed is obviously like extremely related to a lot of democratic processes. So it's a good example. Maybe we can talk about some of the technologies that are being used right now to facilitate participation in the public sphere. So a good example happened in Taiwan, maybe like, I don't know, starting about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, when their digital minister decided to deploy this thing called V-Taiwan, which used a whole bunch of different technologies to elicit public input on democratic decisions directly. So people could submit statements, they could upvote and downvote statements, and then some kind of like clustering methods were used, and I'm sure there was a lot of other things going on there that basically output a pretty sophisticated set of recommendations from the public. People are trying even more sophisticated things like this now with large language models, where basically you sit in a room with people, you talk to this model, and you talk to the people, and the model takes in everything it heard, and it outputs a list of statements that it thinks are representative of what people said. Okay. And so the thing is that like these technologies are really exciting in some ways, especially about like the question of who participates. Because this is, in some ways, a much lower barrier to participation because you can just go online to some platform and say your opinion in whatever form you want. You don't need to put it into a complex ballot or anything like that. So it's more accessible. But then the thing is that what these systems are doing, ultimately, when they make their recommendations, is they're taking all those things and they're internally modeling people's beliefs, and then they're deciding for those people what their judgments would be. Okay, and so this could be seen as a more inclusive process, or it could be seen as a process that is equally uninclusive, but it's just hiding the lack of inclusion behind a very inclusive interface. And so I guess I don't know exactly what we should do in a very like complete sense, but I think one place where we really need people's input is when we design the like fundamental system that's actually modeling what people believe and make judgments on their behalf, because different people have very different belief structures across different cultures, across different societies, and what they even consider to be evidence is really different. And so anyways, this is a really big concern that I have about that, and maybe would be one opportunity to consider.
Great, thank you so much. Others, yeah.
As it relates to participatory design, I think I want to piggyback off of your points and also just mention like the different initiatives that are happening in the AI space, especially at companies like Anthropic. I don't want to talk about Anthropic this entire conversation, but I think they are doing like relatively good work. And with that, I'm sure many of you are aware that for their constitution, at least in its first iteration, it was public informed from about like at least 1,000 public voices. And to that point, I think like when you're creating the values, as you pointed to, like AI value alignment, when you're allowing users to engage in the process of creating like the ideal values for AI alignment, I think that's a great example. I think also to that point, I know OpenAI also has a collective alignment initiative as well, which is similar to that. And they update their model spec based upon the feedback they get from users in their collective alignment surveys with a similar sample size, actually, of 1,000 people. But to that point, I think like initiatives from the company side are, you know, really integral in ensuring that like users have some agency in, you know, the behavior of the models that they're using, because alignment is so important. I think also to that point, like that's a beginning phase, right? There's more that can be done. There's more perspectives that can be involved, especially when you think about the entire world and the diversity of perspectives of users globally, right? Like there are approximately like 8 billion people in this world, and so though a sample size of 1,000 is great, like how can we scale the input of users, though there are people digitally disconnected, of course, how can we scale the input of users more? Because I'm sure you all have heard the narratives in the news around, you know, like scaling AI systems. A lot of companies are pushing for, you know, velocity and scalability. And I think it's like really important to think about how we can scale the democratic input efforts when we're thinking about the behavior of these models. And to that point, I'd like to also call out some interesting research that I saw using synthetic societies to do so. There's still questions around the validity, especially given the non-determinism piece that I mentioned earlier, when you're using like agent personas to simulate entire societies. Like the accuracy in simulating or emulating human behavior is not 100%, of course, but I think that's one way to help in scaling, yes. At the same time, I think on the company side as well. And I'm focusing on companies because obviously like the frontier companies are the ones that are building these models, right? That have impacts on all of us, whether we decide to use them or not, because sometimes they're used in public spaces or they're used by the person near us and may inadvertently impact us. I think like there's the continual need for, yes, increased inclusion, not only from the user perspective, but also to the point of we really need like multi-stakeholder perspectives involved as well. Like users can provide input from their experience using the products. I think also to that point, the efforts that you see of like civil society and like public interest groups providing input and, you know, governments providing input is really important. And I think to that point, like the scalability piece is really key. Obviously, I don't have an answer right now. I have thoughts. I have a proposal pending, but yeah, I think to that point, like having more perspectives, especially globally, when you think about the need for global majority perspectives, are really foundational.
Wonderful, thank you. And I will get to Mona, but I wonder, Mona, you know, you're looking on the other end at the harms and analyzing the outcomes of these in depth, and I wonder how, if you think about feeding all that information back into the process of design, do you see opportunities there to take all of your research and sort of feed it back into the early stages of design?
Sure. In answer to that question, and also connected to what the other panelists mentioned, I worked in data department in retail before, surrounded by 50 great data scientists and software engineers and everything. So it's really interesting when you're in that environment. A lot of focus is on how complicated you can make your model, how automated you can make your model, how more efficient. You can make your code, your Python code, your SQL, and you can work with real-time data, etc., and focus on precision of the models. And so it's really easy in that environment to lose perspective and see how the models that you're developing impact users. Connected to what Lindsay mentioned, it's very important to remind yourself and put yourself in shoes of users and understand what is the consequence of this model, this particular pricing model that you are developing, this coupon that you are putting on cat products, not on food products. What is the impact on the user? Is that the indirect impact that women are receiving more frequent coupons compared to men, etc.? So really, it's important to have close ties with users, put yourself in shoes of users and understand what is their experience, whether this happens through conversation, through surveys or focus groups, etc. Keeping that line of communication is open. But also, as outside of organization, we are all users of these platforms. A lot of this technology are new and they're developing very fast. The negative consequences are not intentional by the organizations who have designed. A lot of these, even they are not aware of these negative consequences. It won't be known unless normal people like us, normal users like us, raise their voice and talk about it. So say something when you see something. So a lot of interesting cases that we are working on really originated from normal users calling us and telling us, well, what has been their experience. I don't want to talk about the specific names here, but some of these cases are very famous on New York Times and everywhere, and we have been involved. Users called us and they told us, we have been working with this particular company in the hiring process. There is this third-party platform that they're using that seems like behind the scene is running a score report without our consent, and we get rejected, we don't get the job, but we are not offered the opportunity to appeal that process and to know what has been going on. So this is a legal issue. We wouldn't know about this problem if people like us would have not called us. I'm not sure, I forgot your question, and I'm not sure if I directly answered that question. A couple of thoughts I had in mind that I wanted to share.
Yeah, absolutely, Lindsay.
Yeah, I'll say as someone who works within a company, I just really want to remind you all of the agency you have, in general, right? But also especially as users, the feedback piece is so important because when you think about these companies, there is a limited number of people in them. And to that point, there's a limited amount of perspective that is had, though, companies try their best in, recruiting some of the brightest minds, but there are gaps, right? And so when users provide feedback on what is not working, that helps companies iterate on their model behavior and so forth. So, and also to that point, I really also want to remind you about the trust piece. If users do not trust companies' technology, then companies don't have customers. And so that's another way that I want to remind people of the agency they have as users, because sometimes it can feel like one is very powerless, but in actuality, everyone has a lot of power. And when you think about collective power, even more so. But giving feedback is really important. And also opting out is also a choice that can be made as well.
Well, great. Thank you so much for this wonderful panel. I've just been so inspired by all the work you've been doing on some of really the most important problems that we're facing in this area. And I know that you've been an inspiration to all of our women in the audience today. So thank you for joining us, and let's everyone thank the panel.